hear me here? Yes. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. It's only the last few months I have realized what the India Cultural Lab is, and the last few hours I realized the scope and range of things that we're doing here, and I'm very honored to be here. It's a new and exciting space, and I think it goes to the credit of the Godrej family to actually encourage a thing like this to happen. Not many corporate houses in India or anywhere in the world that I know of will do a thing like this. So I'm grateful for being here. I'm actually here because in Bombay because we are doing a conference on technology, accountability, and democracy. This is going on as we speak at the Colonial campus. And when I was asked to come here to talk, I thought I would also address the question of corruption, although it's not something I have. Yeah. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Although it's not something I have worked on specifically, but you can also say that it's very difficult to spend sustained periods of time in India without encountering the realities of corruption, which I'll give you a few snippets of that in the talk. What I was trying to do is to give you some glimpses of some of the work I've done in what I call the gray zone in this country. This is what I describe as a vast zone of informal arrangements, economies, and power dynamics that define the lives of what is perhaps still the majority of Indians. And in that zone, which is not really a zone, but actually kind of overlapping with formal institutions and economies in multiple ways, and even in people's homes and so on, you can say that corruption, which I understand to be something which we can call irregular, unequal, exploitative, and unaccountable transactions. I think that's a fairly comprehensive definition. Is not really in that zone. It's not really a discrete phenomenon. It's something that's a thing. It is pretty much the only available currency in which to do transactions. So there's been a lot of talk about the Lokpal bill, and I will not talk about the Lokpal bill, and the repercussions of it, and the watered down version that has been adopted, and so on and so forth. I think a lot of other people have done that much better. So instead, I'll try to talk about corruption as something that has a much, I think, deeper and more systemic life, something that is not just attached to the question of people who are elected to public office, although there are many of them, and they are ever since. Also, the panchayat system has been open to competitive elections. Of course, the number of elected representatives in real competitive elections in India have grown tremendously. So there's no doubt about the scale of the issue around electoral corruption, you can say, but what I want to draw your attention to is something that is at a slightly different level. Because I think we need to understand the depth and systematicity of this corruption. I would argue it's actually integral to virtually every transaction that has to do with state and public institutions, and it's not a new thing, it's far from a new thing. I think it's also difficult to separate these transactions that has to do with public institutions from all kinds of other transactions that are taking place and are carried out in what is still a steeply hierarchical society where class, where caste, community continues to reproduce all kinds of deep and almost unbridgeable segmentations. So if there is anything that's unique to Indian corruption, it may be the scale and the functionality of it. You may have heard these figures that came out when Swiss banks decided to make public their actual holdings from different countries, and it turned out that India came in on a very fine first, 3 times ahead of China and Russia in terms of the actual holdings of rupees or money originating in India. So the scale is enormous, but there is also something about the systematicity of it. It's in fact, because it's, I would argue, attached to a state apparatus that's both very bloated and at the same time relatively functional. I'm not saying it's fully functional, but it's actually relatively functional compared to other places that are plagued by deep systematic corruption the Indian state continues to work, and that maybe also accounts for the scale of corruption. So I learned about the systematicity and the deep ingrained nature of what corruption is when I, many years ago in the mid-80s, was a lowly intern in a huge EU-funded development scheme in coastal Orissa. There the aim was to provide clean drinking water for 25 million people across the entire coastal plain in the state. And there was, of course, plenty of wells to be dug and lots of pipes to be laid and lots of money to be made for everybody involved. For many an evening I spent with the local engineers that I spent most of my time with, I soon got introduced, and I was kind of a babe in the woods at the time, I suppose, into a world of paying your way to advancements, to how to manage by monetary means a career as an engineer, and to get yourself up to the higher ranks where the pickings were even richer. Many of these engineers would share with me their outrage and the ever-rising prices for buying the next office, for the next posting, and some deplored the way that this big project all of a sudden had skewed the market for advancements in their state, but still they all agreed that for them the times were pretty good, and it hadn't been better for a long time. I also learned from them the distinction between wet and dry postings, and in this case it's not just metaphorical, of course, it's a water project. And I also learned about the certain kind of crooked ethics of bribe-taking or payment, that you shouldn't take too much. You should make sure that the cow continues to give milk, as they say in Blom. So above all, I learned about the importance of having someone above, an upar, someone higher up in the system who would listen to you or would be amenable to your request in one way or the other at the right price, of course. Some people have recently estimated that the black economy, or the black money in India, constitutes at least 30% of the real flow of money and services in the country. But from what I gathered when I was in Orissa in those years, I think that would be a modest estimate. I think the pickings were, or the taking away was more like 50. Some years later, I found myself with a research visa in hand in Pune, having to report, being asked to report to the police station in Pune each week on one inane pretext after another. There I found myself, along with various mainly African students from the university, in fact, trying to avoid paying a bribe, and I wasn't very good at it, I have to admit. And how did I manage to avoid, or how could I avoid the sort of unwanted friendship of police officers who constantly suggested that they would come to my house and enjoy some of my scotch? And at the same time, I would, on a regular basis, see some guys working for the Osho commune in Pune being welcomed like royalty in the police station, coming with boxes full of passports and bags full of, guess what? So I had casually mentioned this whole sort of predicament of mine to someone I had met, who was actually a very senior man in the BJP in the city. And suddenly the whole charade stopped. No more returns to the station, no more inane demands. I had clearly found my upar, but not one I had asked for. And what was I, after all, to do with this new unsolicited debt? Now this is the dilemma of the favor, right? What I hadn't realized at the time was that the room in the police station that I got to know so well was in fact not full of people inquiring about their individual pending cases or problems. They were overwhelmed. The people in the room were overwhelmingly professionals of a certain kind, touts, dalal people, whose job it was to liaise with the police, to get information, to sort out cases, to fix problems for other people, and indeed arrange payment. Mostly for people that were poorer or less educated than themselves, for whom approaching the police station was a daunting prospect, which could often result in more problems, in beatings or worse. So instead, the local tout became for many people the sort of hired upar and some kind of perhaps unwanted friend, rolled into one unstable and always a never completely, you could say, reliable figure. So I'll return to these figures. In fact, that's what I'm going to talk about the most. So, but before that, let me just briefly delve into a few aspects of the history of of what corruption is. And let me begin to say that at the very beginning of the colonial state, the East India Company, during the time of the East India Company, there was no distinction made between administration and what today would be called graft. The early officers of the company were not paid very much, if at all, and they were expected to raise their own salary along with the revenues they gathered for their employer. This was following a tradition of Mughal administration, and in keeping with the sort of general policy of the company in those years of going native, the early company, the policy also kept expenses very low, and as we know, the Brits always ran their empire on the cheap. So these company officials adopted local languages, local lifestyles, dress, harems, and so on, and lived like minor kings. The revenue streams they presided over were so huge at the time that the opulence of the officials' lifestyle soon caught the attention of members of the British Parliament. What resulted in it, for those who studied history, will know about the famous trial of Warren Hastings in the 1790s that actually took place over years and years. The Governor-General, it was an unprecedented case, and it involved all kinds of large arguments in Parliament about what empire would or could do to the British character as it was had at the time. Hastings and his company consorts defended themselves by arguing they were actually not doing anything but following local custom. You could say it was a heavily augmented form of the custom. But still, while opponents of building the empire in the East argued that getting involved in these social mores and customs of the East would have all kinds of corrosive and debilitating effects for British society and morality. It didn't stop empires, we know, and throughout much of the 19th century, what the colonial state actually was a kind of help-yourself social mobility machine that allowed men from relatively modest backgrounds in Britain to enrich themselves and return to Britain as wealthy men who then could buy their way directly into respectable society. Another early beneficiary of this system was, of course, a certain Yale, who stole so much money that he got sacked from the British East India Company and was sent in disgrace to a godforsaken cold place on the coast of North America, known as New Haven. And as penance, he decided to invest whatever was left of his theft in a small college in Yale University. It began as a great crime. Anyway, so did Stanford, I think. But anyway, so out of these debates in Britain came the idea that when for the colonial state to be functional and remain functional and free of these sort of what was seen as the inherently corrupting ways of Indian society, it had to observe a scrupulous distance between itself and the people it governed. So this sort of style of government at a distance, you can call it, or standing above society, was enacted by the newly created and powerful civil service apparatus that was seen to be a hope to be somewhat incorruptible through all kinds of rituals of aloofness, which we still live with in India to this day. It also created the perception, the illusion, clearly, that at the higher echelons of the state, officers were fair-minded, secular, clean, while the lower echelons, which from the beginning were mostly Indians, by the way, the lower echelons were under constant suspicion of being corrupt, being amenable to bribes, irregularities, and so on. And this is still a kind of mindset, and you could say a particular kind of illusion about how the Indian state works. That's with us to this day. Now maybe only the Supreme Court is left standing as a clean instance. But so this is something, when you look into the records, when you listen to a lot of the anti-corruption rhetoric, one gets the impression that this is something that has become much worse of late, but it's not the first time. There's been recurrent moral panics about this. One of the big ones was in the 50s and early 60s, where major commissions of inquiry were established to create a full mapping of what corruption did and perhaps would do to the new independent Indian state, and so on and so forth. And out of that came a number of reports that resulted in in new regulatory bodies such as the Central Vigilance Commission and a whole set of other sort of bureaucratic measures, which of course didn't have much effect. Out of that came also, though, something that's still with us very much today, which is a particular kind of Gandhian-inflected, patriotic kind of morality, or sort of discourse of morality around it, that corruption really was a problem, is a moral problem of the officer who is forgetting his patriotic duty and so on and so forth, which is still with us. But as I'll argue in the following, corruption is actually not just a moral problem, it's actually a fundamentally structural problem, the way in which state and society fits together in India, or doesn't fit together. So this went on for some time. So I want to focus on just now on what happened about a couple of decades ago, when the actually gradually changed. It's been on the question of the whole debate about corruption always been about the bureaucracy. Right? From Warren Hastings onwards, it's always been about the bureaucrats. But sort of 2 decades ago, the action changed gradually towards a focus on the elected politicians as the source and the cause also of large-scale corruption at all levels and other forms of malpractice. And this comes along with the whole worry, which is of course in part a very legitimate worry about the criminalization of politics, to a point where many people today feel that it's the popular electoral politics itself which is the main driver of corruption. In fact, there was a presentation this morning at this conference that was arguing exactly that. And of course, with that comes the attendant idea that some form of benevolent strongman might come in and clean up this mess. But this is, of course, not the first time. For those of you who are older will recall that Mrs. Gandhi had a similar idea that didn't fare so well. So what accounts for this change? Why is it all of a sudden electoral politics that has become also the whole debate about your part that has become in focus? So I'll just say, just make a few points and then get on to my some of the stories I want to tell you about people I've met over the years who are engaged in what I would call corrupt practices, but have no choice but actually doing that as a full-time profession. Not that I want to defend them, I want to present them to you. Because they're real people, there are millions of them across this country. So what has happened more recently, in recent decades? Well, it's clear that as the political monopoly of Congress has fallen apart in the last 20 years, 30 years across the country, there's more competition for every seat. So the whole, you can say, the economy of elections, the economy of seeking, of trying to seek office has just expanded enormously. There are many more candidates, many more people trying to buy votes and get into office, to buy tickets, and so on and so forth. So that's one obvious thing. So the demand for that is bigger. The other thing that's happened, secondly, is that the social profiles of those who are elected to political office today is much closer to being representative of the actual population in India than it's ever been before. Now, my colleague Christophe Chavalot has called this the silent revolution that has been taking place after Mandal, basically, in the 80s, from the 80s onwards. And it's meant that for the middle class, many politicians today appear more unfamiliar, less educated, while for the larger communities that many of these new politicians, not so many anymore, have come out of, their elected representatives are indeed seen as one of us, at least one that bears the same surname as me, perhaps, or as them. And for many, there is a vague and often unfounded hope, and people know this very well, that this will mean that their own community might enjoy more access to resources. Many will simply say that the track record of previous governments, dominated by higher caste people, bear this out. They clearly help their own more than they help people under the wrongs. Now, this is a sentiment. This is not necessarily always a fact. It's a sentiment that has less to do with how political life is conducted than with how everyday life continues to be lived in this deep segmentation and separation between communities, and how caste privilege continues to be a real issue. I know that there are many people belonging to the so-called general caste who will take issue with this or challenge this view, but I would argue against that, that as we know from other contexts, the experience of and the effects of social hierarchies are not easy to ascertain and fully understand if you look at them from above. they are best understood from below, or must also be understood from below. And it is a fact, and it's an incontrovertible fact, that for many historically disadvantaged communities in this country, electoral politics continues to be the best and highly imperfect, but still the best and maybe the only promise of some form of collective progress. The third thing that's happened is that the social profile of bureaucracy has changed through reservations and through the pressure of regional parties. Today, bureaucrats are not as sociologically representative as politicians are, but the gap is closing. And fourthly, the private sector has expanded so much that the scope for careers and social mobility are completely different today than they were just 20 years ago. It has, in some ways, reduced the dependency of government services for some people and changed the nature of demands and expectations of what kind of quality of service one can expect. So the net effect of this, what Christophe Chaponneau calls the deepening of democracy, has also been what I would call a certain democratization of corruption, by which I mean that larger and more diverse groups of groups and individuals are involved in the game of siphoning off resources from the public sector than ever before. It also means that it's more likely than ever before that average middle-class people of some standing and education will be asked for donations and bribes by political figures, by bureaucrats, who are obviously less educated, poorer, and of lower social standing in the caste hierarchy and other hierarchies than they are in the parents. In the late 70s, or in the 70s or 60s, paying a bribe often meant paying to someone who had been slightly more fortunate in life than you, at least for many people that do that, getting ahead in life a little more than you, often someone who could be said to be your social equal or maybe even your superior. It was also a monopoly game, as it were. If you didn't pay, nothing would happen. Today, this is different. The scale of corruption is dramatically bigger. The beneficiaries are different, and they're certainly perceived to be different, and the legitimacy of the bribe is dramatically affected by this democratization of corruption. So that's the first one. Now the problem with this is, of course, that this is true mainly from a certain point of view, that is mainly from the point of view of the more privileged groups in this country. Among the underprivileged majority, it's clear that fewer things have changed. If you grew up in a slum or a very poor area and belong to a low-status community, the idea that you need and require you need multiple connections, you need a lot of luck to get a job or simply get on in life is as natural as can be. This does not mean that corrupt practices are condoned or legitimate among less privileged people. Of course not. It is simply that for most people there has been no reason or no experience that has showed that things could be in any other way. Or put differently, if one lives in a world where life is a struggle and trust and predictability is in short supply, why would anyone believe that the field of politics or public services would be any different? So the police officer, the municipal officer, the local school, the ration shop, the water engineer, all these are figures that can be approached only with a measure of caution and through people, preferably through people who have connections, or at least a claim to have connections, and they will of course charge you good money for it as well. If handled badly, these encounters can be damaging or even dangerous, and they can land people in serious trouble. This perception of public institutions as difficult to approach, as fickle, as unpredictable, all goes back to the colonial state, but it's also based on the experiences of the last many decades of a state that's always appeared somewhat indifferent and not really interested in intervening very deeply into the actual problems of life situations of the underprivileged. If one adds to that an ever more dynamic political democracy, popular democracy, as I was talking about, the result has been that specialists in connections have become integral to how popular democracy actually works in this country. This is the field where political parties earn their stripes and establish credibility, and where they recruit men and women of talent. And my fundamental point is this, and I'll spend the rest of the time acquainting you with some of these figures. The local broker, the local big man, the local busybody, whatever you want to call him, it's often a him and some women as well. It's an often underestimated pivot of how public institutions, political parties, and local communities interact. These, in fact, little big men are not necessarily respected, but they're often feared, at times admired for their ruthlessness and their ability to get things done. Ubiquitous networks of strong men, brokers, fixers, whatever you want to call them, installed in Indian cities. Most of these activities defy conventional distinctions between legality and illegality. In fact, they're rather impervious to this distinction. They assist people in getting water connections, jobs, housing, school admission. They adjudicate disputes between neighbors, provide protection to those who are loyal and dependent on them. But they also serve as debt. They extort money. Occasionally, some of them will beat up opponents and threaten those who defy them or betray them. They're not nice people. But however morally ambiguous these men and their activities are in the eyes of local residents, they are nonetheless a kind of an elementary unit of local politics, of social work, and cultural organization. There's a famous example of one of my colleagues, Emma Tarlow, has in her book on emergency described in very telling detail how when Mrs. Gandhi tried to declare war on these middlemen, touts, and whatever, to want to implement her terrible sterilization program, she wanted the bureaucrats to go directly go and fulfill their quotas directly, and the program soon ran into terrible trouble because they couldn't actually find the right number of people on which they could perform their surgeries and so on and so forth. So it was only after about a year that this program then decided to re-employ or again take the services of many of these local fixers in the neighborhoods, and especially in North India, but also elsewhere, and that's when the program actually began to work. So this shows, at least at that time, I'll come back to this at the end of the talk, at least at that time, it was very difficult for the Indian state actually to function without having access to the services among ordinary and poorer people, without having access and working through these brokers and fixers. So let me offer you three brief sketches of three men from underprivileged backgrounds and whose lives became defined by their talent in this particular field and also who managed to rise to a certain prominence. I'm sure some of you would have met characters like this. So when I first met Prakash in 1989, he worked part-time in a local hotel, clearing tables and serving tea. And I'm told that serving tea can lead to great things nowadays, but nobody had told Prakash that. So he had finished his school, but never managed to get a proper job. He was very friendly, charming, personable, character possessed by a mighty energy and gregariousness, so much so that his family feared that they would get him in trouble very soon. But these qualities soon meant that it fell on Prakash to deal with their very difficult and cranky landlord in the hope that his charm and likable manner would soften the mood of this man who was constantly asking for more rent in this actually very skimpy house they lived on. They had built on a small plot of land. Prakash was annoyed by this, and he decided to follow up on one persistent rumor in the neighborhood that the landlord was in fact not the owner of the land, where the family, along with 50 other families, had built their small houses and apartments over the years. So he dressed nicely and adapted his best manners, and he got access to land records, and after sifting patiently through them, he found out that land indeed was owned by a family that lived in South Bombay, who had leased it to this landlord for him to keep cows many years ago. Now Prakash and his friends, and this is before before he became a real estate investor, so land was not as precious and valuable as it is today. Prakash and some friends decided to pay a visit to his family, and they met the old man who had basically owned his land, who had also given over much of the administration of his business to a lawyer. He didn't pay much attention to this. So they told them what their land now was, what had happened. It was densely packed with small houses and apartments, and the landlord made a killing from extortion with rents. Soon, the landlord disappeared, and the harassment also of the families on the land also stopped. Now, this feat earned for Prakash, who was only a young man at the time, a certain standing among the families on the block. He began now to ask him for help for all kinds of other matters concerning official documents and access to local municipal extension offices and so on. Now, Prakash was a very quick study, and he soon learned many of the intricacies around rental agreements, land leases, and municipal statutes and regulations pertaining to this area. And soon, of course, he attracted the attention of local Shivseniks who always looked for local talent. Prakash would begin to hang out around the local shaka and also occasionally the office of the legendary Anandika. Some of you might have heard of this man, also the king of Thane at the time he was alive. He died in style, of course, as he lived. He would gradually be seen to be one of the Seniks, although he was never a street fighter and not someone possessed by the need to earn his stripes through physical bravado. He would also always rely on his personality and his brain. But he realized that this association with Shiv Sena made a real difference in terms of what he could achieve in what was now becoming his profession, and he began to call it social work that began sort of to take all his time. His knack for understanding legal details and how things work, combined with a charming and likable manner, made him a ubiquitous presence in municipal offices, in police tunnels, school admission boards, and so on. And in these spaces, he would plead, charm, argue, and pay in equal measure. And he earned a reputation for actually producing results. He was soon, because of his success, threatened by rivals and other professionals like himself who felt that he was encroaching on their turf. And on several occasions, he got serious threats. And although he wanted to escape the embrace of Sena, it was clear that he couldn't do it without being peril. But some years later, the break came, and he tried to go on his own. And at that time, he had moved to a slightly better neighborhood, got married, and started a family. He was no longer the innocent young man helping his neighbors, but he was a seasoned operator who still enjoyed the trust of some people, but also seen as tough and selfish and heartless by most other people. I haven't seen him for many years and lost contact with him many years ago, but the last thing I heard was that he had tried his hand at becoming a builder in his own right, with his own money. He had fallen out with his former protectors, and soon his house was burned down. Prakash and his family had relocated to another part of Mumbai. So that's one story. And meet Subhash, who was born a Jadav to a poor farming family in the village in Marathwada. He decided that he moved to Aurangabad to seek his fortune, to change his name to Patil. And nobody really cared to check. But Patil is a good name to carry. So like Prakash, he was an obviously intelligent man with a winning personality. He had planned to enroll in a college, and he did for 1 year, but instead he soon threw himself headlong into the seething political conflicts that engulfed the city at that time in the 1980s. The city of Aurangabad had been, as you know, an administrative center in the Nizami state, Hyderabad, until 1950, and still had a sizable, very large population of Muslims. Shiv Sena soon identified the city as a fertile ground for expansion into the hinterland of the state, and Thakre's call for Hindu action attracted a large number of young Hindu men, such as Subhash. His energy and leadership soon made him into a natural leader of the young street fighters who attack Muslim shops, engage in street brawls with young Muslims, and so on. He and his gang were soon instrumental in winning a majority of seats for the Shiv Sena in the municipal corporation, a majority they actually hold to this very day. And then a new phase of consolidation and institutional bargaining commenced, and this was not what Patil or Subhash was good at. He was a charismatic speaker and organizer, but he could not really respond to the new demands from the party leadership for funding and major contributions. So frustrated and disappointed, he left the party along with a number of long-standing associates. And it took him years to come to terms with this. Even today, I met him last year, and he feels somewhat betrayed by it still. His demoting was clearly born out of Godrej's well-known hostility to young, charismatic leaders who would perhaps in time challenge his own authority. He was not the only one who was unceremoniously sort of chucked out of the party. And so soon after, Godrej got involved in a trade union in Aurangabad, in one of the many new industrial areas of the city. He also started an irrigation society back in his ancestral village, where he had become a somewhat respected figure during his years in Aurangabad. His personal following and his reputation as a fiery and fearless leader, albeit not a big one, made him attractive to other political formations, and he tried his luck with the Congress Party and so on, but never managed to get elected to any office. Later, he got involved in sugar cooperatives and all the rest of it you do if you want to make it in public life in that part of the state. So he was a very effective trade union leader in a certain way, feared by the owners and other unions for his unveiled threats of violent action. And he gradually rose to become a man, a leader in his own right, a man accorded considerable autonomy by virtue of his influence, his popularity, but also his sort of movement, gradual movement from street violence to more respectable, big man. Today, he's a well-established broker of contacts between cash-rich landowners in the area and all kinds of institutions in the city of Aurangabad. He channels money into a new college in the city, one of many, that caters to Marathas and other landed caste communities, and he's involved in a housing society that seeks to provide relatively inexpensive housing to students and disadvantaged families. He's not seen locally as fair or clean, but he's seen as effective in doing particular things of the kind of work for particular kinds of people. He won't be approached by anyone. So most of the people who today visit his house, like they did when I met him initially, do that to seek his advice, to secure his support in disputes, to draw on his personal connection built over many years with hundreds of people in the institutions and public offices in the city and the region, and also to ask for some kind of protection. And his reputation is still strong enough that a few phone calls indicating he's behind someone or looking into a matter can actually make a difference. So let me give you the last one, and then I'll wrap up with a few considerations. Now, Javid came to Bombay with his parents from an impoverished village in Uttar Pradesh. Grew up in a chawl in the old middle district in Bombay. He had to leave school early to help his father run a small flour mill that he had set up. He soon learned traditional wrestling at the local khana and soon emerged as one of the best polvans in the neighborhood. He acquired a certain reputation for being a strong and short-tempered man that no one would challenge at their own peril, and who also got involved with some kinds of dubious and illegal activities in the area. Javid had actually quickly become one of the hard men of Hawaii who was aspiring to something slightly bigger. And almost inevitably, he would clash with the local dada in the street, and he would actually kill him in an epic street fight that's still talked about in the locality. He served time in prison, but he didn't seem to regret anything. The murder and his sentencing were questions of honor and self-respect. If I hadn't done it, he would have killed me and humiliated me. I had no choice, he told me. After his release, he started a business in scrap metals, which over the years made him a relatively well-to-do man with cars and his son studying at college. He also turned more to Islam and started to donate money to a local madrasa and to the local college attended by his sons. He was known to most residents in the neighborhood and respected for what he was, but also known more as a warrior who could defend the neighborhood in times of trouble. And indeed, as it happened, and this is when I met him in the mid-90s, as it happened during the Bombay riots in 92, 93, where during those tense weeks, Javid was in the streets with his men and his sons and others fighting and defending the neighborhood. And people gave him a lot of credit for that, as people do in these situations, to people who stand up for the community. Most respectable and educated middle-class communities despise Javid and everything he stands for. More than one educated man, I remember one particularly, told me off for spending time with him. But he's not even a real Khan. He calls himself one. He's just a Judaha. He's a simple criminal. So why do you spend time with him? But many poorer residents, and particularly those, and this is what as politics run into all the time, we do spend time with all kinds of people that are sometimes of dubious reputation. But many people in the neighborhood would seek his advice and seek his services, and would come to his modest office that had a few telephones, a table, a few chairs. And most evenings, Javid would receive visitors who asked for assistance in getting a job, some help with getting a telephone connection. This is 90s, no more relevant. Donations for poor families, protection against abusive employers or landlords, all the sort of normal problems that people have. Often a few phone calls from Javid would solve the problem, as his reputation in itself would make a difference, as in the case of the other guys I talked about. In other cases, more difficult cases, Javid or some of his men would pay a little visit to those concerned, and this would also work often. Like many Muslims, Javid's family had supported the Congress Party for the longest time, but after the riots in 92-93, they, like most others, turned towards the Samajwadi Party for protection and some kind of voice. In the late 90s, Javid became the chairman of the local branch. And some years later, he ran unsuccessfully for a seat in the municipal elections in Bombay. But he still hoped, last time I saw him, to expand his reputation for being a social worker, to become a real sort of respected political leader in the future. I don't think that's going to happen. Not because of his background is unusual, or what he does or stands for is unusual, but just because time is running out for him in terms of age. So the reputations and the particular profiles of these three men I just described to you are of course ambiguous. And they're dependent on various reputations or associations with violence or the capacity for violence. It's also dependent on being connected to the bureaucracy and protected by other powerful players, perhaps. But it's far from any cushion or stable existence. It's hard work. While these local big men clearly operate in a gray zone and at times appear to challenge the authority of the bureaucracy by bending the law and flouting regulations, the same men are also very useful partners in maintaining order and creating legibility, gathering information, and so on. When there's trouble, for instance, it's often these figures who are gathered by the police from all sides to sit down and try to work out some kind of agreement of peace. They also work with all kinds of people in government and so on. But they both have an official and an unofficial existence. Policemen, local bureaucrats, builders, politicians, NGOs, all these people have to reckon with these figures. You cannot ignore them. At times, they may have to be won over to harness support for this or the other. At other times, they may have to be kept at arm's length. And most local people will look at such figures with a certain kind of practical cynicism. They are a fact of life. They are exploitative indeed. They're useful. They're always self-interested. They're never morally clean. But they're there. They're accessible. And they're available if you need something done. And if you don't have other options, and most people do not, that's where you go. So are these men corrupt? Are they purveyors of corrupt practices? Oh yeah, indeed, they are. Big time. They don't see themselves as clean, but as professionals. Sometimes tinged with some heroic claim to a more altruistic motive as well. But are they in these professions in order just to rob, scam people, as they're sometimes portrayed? Not really. I think they're just bits and pieces in a machine that's much bigger than them. And they also think like that about themselves. They're obviously talented, autodidact, ambitious, and intelligent men. who have found some kind of niche for themselves. Had they been born on the other side of the tracks, I have no doubt that they would have made very fine careers in respectable society. So the careers, so the point here is that this zone in which, the gray zone in which the men operate, is of course circumstances that they themselves have not chosen. A distant state and bureaucracy, a hierarchical society where moral obligation in itself is segmented and graded according to the standing of the next person. Is he of my kind, of my standing? Is he even a proper person? Or is he only worth some drops of pay? What are the repercussions of stealing from him, ignoring him, or even worse? This is a reality. We can't escape it. If we add to this a bustling popular democracy espousing the value of equality, print and promising hope based on the principle of one man, one vote, we shouldn't really be surprised that this gray zone that connects the formal and the informal, where rising expectations of the disadvantaged can get tenuously connected to the formal system, is so large but also so persistently murky. We shouldn't be surprised that there are hundreds of thousands, maybe millions operating in the gray zone, not because they really want to live such precarious lives, but because that's the zone that modern Indian society has rendered open. So I'll just end with this thought, that one of the things that came up today in this conference was that lots of people are working in incredibly innovative and interesting ways to create various kinds of technological devices that can create people directly with, as the UID scheme and many other schemes, so to in fact bypass figures like this. Although getting pensions for people and whatever social payments is not what they mostly do. But that's the idea. This is a very old idea in the Indian bureaucracy, in fact, is to bypass this level, right? And there's no doubt that these schemes will do something. It's also clear from some of the early evidence coming out already that for each point there is a cash point in a village or a new form of expertise, where computer skills or other skills are needed, figures that will provide this particular expertise to a large group of a majority of people who are without those skills will also emerge and will also begin to charge for their services. So we have to ask ourselves a more deeper question, which is, what are the structures that reproduce this zone, this gray zone? It seems to me that a technological system is going to help a whole lot with a number of different public services, but it's not going to remove the need for the people's need for protection. In fact, you can go and get a direct payment into a bank account if you manage to get a bank account, and the hoops you have to jump through in order to get a bank account. Forget about that. But let's just assume you get a bank account. It doesn't mean that your precarious tenancy agreement with your landlord will go away. It doesn't mean that your felt need to be protected by someone in times of trouble, or if you cannot pay your rent and you will be threatened by eviction, that felt need when you are a person without resources, without formal education, that need will not go away. So there is a market for protection, there's a market for connections, and this is born directly out of the fundamental social structure of this country, and no technological fix can really address that. So the reason why I put these stories to you is that I think these guys, if you go out and meet some of these people in 10 years from now, they might not be doing exactly the things that the figures I've met over the past 15, 20 years do. They might be doing other things. They might certainly have better computer skills, for one, and so on and so forth. But my guess is that they will be there. They will do different things, and they will be there as long as there is that fundamental gulf between a very large number of people who want to get connected to all kinds of formal institutional spaces and sources of futures, and and the relative scarcity of those options. As long as that's there, as long as the government is seen as distant, as long as society is seen as being for the bottom, for the big people, for those who can do real things, then there will be a need for these people. I'm not defending them. They obviously break the law. It's very difficult to live in circumstances like that and not break the law. But they are affected by it. Thank you.
Can we take questions right now?
Yeah. Compared to India, is the corruption or society similar in other developing countries of a similar developed index or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's difficult to measure exactly. You know, one of the there's Transparency International, which is this organization that has set its goal to measure, to develop a kind of index for corruption. And India always scores pretty low. That is around, you know, out of 150 countries, India comes in around 100 or so. You know, has moved up a little bit. And it's not the only reliable index, of course. I don't think there's any. I mean, the scale and the size of the Indian economy and the size and the scale of the black economy in India is such that there's no doubt that in absolute terms, the circulation of the corruption as a phenomenon is bigger in absolute terms in India than anywhere else. But what I said in the beginning, I think what's unique about India and interesting and something that is different from countries like Pakistan, countries like Nigeria, or countries like some of the new republics in Central Asia that have also very high levels of corruption, is that the Indian state is nonetheless a functional thing. It's as if it doesn't come to a point of complete dysfunctionality. It comes to degrees of dysfunctionality. But there's actually a system that goes on. There are pay commissions, and there are implementations. There are always imperfect implementations of everything. But it works, which is why I think it goes on. So I think this is something which I think we probably need to study more, also in a comparative perspective. I have not read enough comparative corruption literature to actually be able to say this with a great deal of conviction. But I think that what characterizes India is that there is more, it's more systematic, it's spread out across all kinds of fields, whereas some countries like Brazil or Mexico or whatever are also famous for a lot of corruption. You have very massive corruption in some sectors, and other sectors much less so. In India, it seems to be even distributed, which is, I don't know what that says, but.
Hi. So the examples that you gave, the 3 people that you mentioned, seem to suggest that, I mean, there's the lacunae in the system kind of engendered that corruption, that they didn't have too many options. My thought is that the kind of corruption that they did, the black money that got generated because of that, is probably a very small portion of that 50% that you talked about. There's one other dimension of corruption wherein people who may not be less privileged but who have a lot of money, the crony capitalism that I'm talking about, did you experience that? I mean, you didn't talk about that at all. I would say that probably is a bigger contributor of corruption, and probably that's the cause of all the other lacunae and the corruption that you see at the lower levels, with the examples that you talked about.
I agree. I completely agree. It's not a world that's it's a very difficult world to investigate and to even know about. It's often distinctly unhealthy to probe it when the money is big. It's something that's very difficult to ascertain, but there's no doubt about it. What the best example is, of course, post-communist Russia, where you can say that corruption starts at the top in a big way, and the sort of grand theft schemes of a magnitude that's almost unimaginable.
I mean, even in India.
Even in India, it's come to that, yeah, absolutely. So it is petty, but this what I'm talking about is actually, in a sense, a form of practice that people would not themselves necessarily, I think they would call it corruption, but they would not necessarily see it as something that is fundamentally morally flawed. They see it as something that is fundamentally necessary. But it is nonetheless, I mean, what I'm saying is, of course, that there is there's no doubt that there is really big corruption at a level and that's expanding. And it has indeed expanded very, very rapidly as the cake has gotten much bigger. But I think in order to understand how it happens and how this corruption happens, I think it's important not to isolate those bigger scams or those bigger practices from the way in which many other transactions are being carried out in everyday life. So what I'm saying is that if you want to fight corruption, you can local bill is an excellent idea. I'm a wholehearted supporter of it. I think it's fine. But I don't think that's going to address the fundamental question of how do you actually do transactions with the next person? How do you create a kind of situation where it's possible and it's actually rewarded to follow the rules, right? Because at the moment it's not rewarded to follow the rules. And it's clear that people who live at the sort of lower end of the economic scale, which is the majority of people in this country, are absolutely not able to get out of that cycle. They don't have a choice. Even if you want to be honest or do things the proper way, how can you do it? And this, I think, is that's a real political problem to be honest. And I wish the Aam Aadmi Party well. My good friend Vivendra Yadav is now going straight to Haryana and challenging Jat power and so on. And I think that's very, very interesting what's happening there. And I think in some of what they are doing, they have actually understood also that one can attack corruption at the big level, but one also has to address some of these more fundamental inequalities, because without addressing those, there will still be corruption on a massive, broad scale that will actually hurt people, and it hurts people.
Yeah, as in not denying the fact that you said in absolute terms, India has more corruption. I just wanted to point out that Joseph Stiglitz, the Columbia University professor who came here, said in an interview that corruption in India is not extraordinary as such, and even in the United States, in the federal level, there is corruption, even in the barrios, the Hispanic areas, not to point out to certain people. And in China, the Communist Party has a stranglehold over everything. So I just wanted your perspective. Now there's also a debate on the taxation regime in India as to make it, to simplify it. So what I wanted was your perspective on the fact that there are more illicit outflows out of China as well as India. And what could India do to alter its taxation regime as such to make it more rational or less prone to corruption?
I just have to say, Thomas, he's an anthropologist.
That's right. I was just going to pee. I'm just going to pee innocence here. You know, I'm actually not able to talk to.
Only anthropologists could rule the world.
I mean, taxation is something I'm not able to address really. What I want to say is this. I know it's an argument that goes around very often, and I think it is a valid argument that corruption is a universal phenomenon, and it's there, and you know that the United States of America is built on it. No one who has studied Chicago history will claim that the U.S. was clean, or studied the career of big magnates who later went on to found universities, that they were clean. Now, and you can say that the Chinese are as bad and the Russians are even worse and so on. I don't think that's a relevant point. I think that's completely beside the point, because the question of what happens in India and the kind of dynamics of corruption that I talk about now, that's not what happens in China. That's something very different. So this is a political problem that has to be addressed in India. I think the problems in Pakistan are different, the problems in Sri Lanka are different and so on. So I think each country has to, in a sense, instead of saying, "Oh, well, we're just doing the universal thing." Hey, that's great. You know, say what is the problem here, and how is our problem actually unique, and how can that be addressed? And what and this country that has to do with addressing both forms of accountability and certainly, I'm sure, taxation. Although it's only recently that many people started to pay tax in this country, the income tax, really. So that's a whole different issue, but it will all help. But I think the comparing India with other countries is like it maybe can make people feel good or whatever, but I don't think it makes the problem go away. Right?
I'm going to take 3 more questions. So
you can bundle them. Do you want to bundle them?
No. Yeah.
Hi. How much of a role does the uncontrolled increase in population? What is? How much of a role does the uncontrolled increase in population? We are 1,200 million here.
Yeah.
So, what is the role of this runaway train, population train, have in terms of impacting or in terms of sustaining this monster of corruption?
Well, I mean, it put, of course, like many other factors, it puts a strain on resources. I don't think, I mean, if you look at the population growth, and I rely on what colleagues of mine, demographers, actually have shown, is that the population growth in India is far from as much out of control as you would think. And there is still one thing that is one law, you can say, that demographers have discovered way back in the 50s, is that there is a strict correlation between the level of education of women and how many kids they have. There is no doubt about it. There's the single strongest one. The other strong correlation is the future prospects. So in India, in the places where you have strong economic growth, regionally, you have a very significant fall of leveling off in the population, whereas in the northeast, not northeast, but in the northern and eastern part of India, where that's not the case, you see much higher levels of fertility across communities, and so on and so forth. So I think I would be less worried about that. I think the demographic sort of growth is not necessarily, I mean, it's a huge problem, it's a strain on resources, but it's not ultimately that which is going to determine anything. I think economic performance is going to absorb that, and it's going to address that things. And but it's inequality. I mean, the populous and the highest population growth you find in the world are always in the countries where you have sluggish economic growth paired with very steep inequalities. That's where you have it. In other places in the world, but that's not the case. You have stagnating populations or leveling off. So I'm not. So that would be my answer.
Yeah, and my information may not be correct, Professor. I had heard that in Singapore, in Singapore, they pay their ministers so well that they kind of don't start corruption and they control the law. Is that the solution, that we pay our ministers well and then corruption will stop?
That's a very good question. I think it wouldn't hurt. It would hurt. Even if you paid them really well, you'd probably save money. You know what I mean? So I think there's room for experimentation without actually wasting money. I think it's one thing, but again, I see the minister is just a tip of the iceberg, right? And so what I was talking about, the way in which elections get financed, the way in which political parties function in everyday life, and so on, they are building on the skills and capacities of exactly those guys I talked about. You cannot survive, and again, Aam Aadmi Party, I wish you well, you cannot survive in Indian politics. I have not seen any example of surviving without building on that, and that machine, that capacity it provides in terms of raising funds and getting, mobilizing votes. You have to get out there. It's very few parties that you have to, in a sense, mobilize that layer in order to reach out to the voters. And often through people who are trusted, trusted in you know, inverted commas, in the sense that they are trusted devils. I mean, you know that this is, okay, now he's running, well, you know, he's not as bad as that guy, so I'll give him my vote, and so on and so forth. And this is how popular democracy works, and that requires fundraising at all kinds of levels. So I think even if you pay the ministers really well, they will still have to engage in all kinds of very large-scale fundraising operations in a very competitive democracy to manage. So I don't think it would solve it completely. It would address some of it, perhaps.
Okay, one second. You don't have a mic. You can shout.
Yeah, I'll shout.
I can hear you.
Professor, do you have any policy recommendations on this issue? And is there any way they could be acceptable to people?
Well, I think it's very clear. Again, you know, people always compare with China and India. And I was just in China, spent a little time there, and for better or for worse, it's not a democratic state, it's not a liberal state, it likes to control everything very tightly. But what they do is that they do not accept large zones in the cities or in the countryside for that matter, where there is no real effective governance. Right? Because that's actually the case in this country. Right? So although I know it's very popular, everybody talks about, you know, we have to roll back the state and, you know, the government is too big and all that. Yes, I think the Indian government is too big in the wrong way, but it's actually way too small. And this is a real concern. I mean, if you study all the successful, economically well-performing countries, including Brazil, including Taiwan, South Korea, all of them, that the tiger economy. So we look at the kind of public expenditure that's gone into it. It's gone into fundamental services, fundamental education. You cannot jump over that stage. You cannot hope that those needs will go away. So I think the only way that India can actually both achieve a kind of more stable and perhaps in time and more transparent economy with well-paid and happy ministers, as well as a much more strongly based economy, is to begin to reallocate funds to these fundamental basic services that have been so neglected. I don't think there is any shortcut. There is no shortcut that can lift this country to a new level of economic performance that does not address them. And think of the enormous waste of talent. I mean, I was struck when I did this work by the number of people I met who were people who were bursting with talent, bursting with energy, bursting with initiative, but who were, in a sense, stuck where they were. In the meantime, yes, there is more mobility, more people get a chance, but the number of people who come from the other side of the tracks, as it were, who actually every year get a chance in India, it's very small. And it's way too small. So that's the policy. Elementary education, fundamental healthcare. I don't know what possessed governments after governments in India to think that one can actually lift a country out of poverty based on an economy that's overwhelmingly based on skilled labor. It is in my view, politically and economically unsupported, not sustainable economy. So that's it's a very small policy to manage. Just get you it.
Just taking off from where he was, you spent some time talking about grassroots corruption.
Yeah.
Maybe it's a notion I have, but I haven't heard much about the kleptocracy on the top.
Right.
Somebody once told me that entire Maharashtra was controlled by 98 families.
Sure.
So the prism that I'm looking at is the role of media and how it's fueling unrest and outrage. You spoke about the Aam Aadmi Party, which deals with the unrest which you've been discussing, the three characters that you've painted. How do you relate that to top-level corruption? We have possibly the most corrupt government, arguably.
Yeah.
2G, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
What's the relativity and where do you see unrest going from the way media is pushing it? You know, Aam Aadmi law minister going to the police, cameras into a press conference every day. It's becoming a model,
Sure.
which is now happening in Maharashtra, in Haryana, a couple other places.
Yeah.
Long question.
No, it's a good question. Thank you. The media, let me begin with the large-scale corruption. As I said, it's very difficult to investigate, and if you, I don't know of anyone who can give a full account of what Sharad Pawar has been up to the last 30 years. I don't know why you talk about 98 families. I would talk about fewer, but anyway, sorry, that's a joke. But maybe not. So
Going up on YouTube, huh?
yes, I know. I didn't say anything.
Not yet.
I think the no, I mean people have said much worse things. Yeah, so I'm fine. The media, I think, is a very interesting picture because you have two things happening, right? You have on one hand you have increasing political control of media, newspapers and so on, and TV stations, and political parties trying to muscle their way into that market. Where the age of the old newspaper tycoon and so on, that with an independent, the Indian Express story and the rest of it, is over, right? That's not, we live in a different age, and newspapers also occupy, although they're expanding in India in a way that they don't in most other parts of the world. But it's clear that someone sort of quoted a figure of estimate that 60% of the electronic media are actually controlled one way or the other by political information. Now, that is a problem on one level. Another level, it's also well known in many other parts of the world that has had flourishing democracies where different media have been known to be friendly to this side or that side. In the US, we know that Fox is not pro-Democrat, right? And so on. It's not necessarily detrimental to the kind of democratic development. But the other thing is that, of course, that the whole capacity of what media can do is sort of radically different today from what it was just 1 or 2 decades ago in terms of what you can do in terms of handheld cameras and so on. And of course, Mr. Tejpal has been pioneering some of this before he landed himself in trouble. So I think it's very contradictory. I never believe in the people who say blame the media for various ills. I think the media are going along with different other trends. They don't generate something out of their own. I don't really think so. They can play a positive role at times, like around the rape case and so on. There was, in other cases, I think they can play a negative role, a great deal of obfuscation, a great deal of non-news, right? News being silenced and so on. On the other hand, we live in a time where a lot of people rely on all kinds of other news feeds and so on. So for those who want to be informed, there are ways to get it. And I don't think we should necessarily blame the media for a lot of the things that are happening. I think the media is a kind of barometer, it's a kind of symptom of something, but it's not the cause. And but the last point of how this, what I talked about, connects to the larger corruption, I think this is perhaps the more bad news, is that the economic progress in India the last 2 decades has actually meant that political parties such as Congress and other major commissions are able to raise and generate such enormous revenue from getting their hands in various ways on resources generated by in the big formal sector, that the kind of grassroots mobilization and sustaining a network of people who are activists and who raise bits of money or will do whatever to run for office or will generate support for the party and so on, that grassroots organization is actually suffering because the big money coming in makes for the possibility of a completely centrally funded, centrally directed campaign. In the case of Congress, I think that's going to backfire very badly, and I think that nobody else, I haven't met anyone else who doesn't believe that. But I think there is so as much as these figures I was talking about are dubious and, in a sense, reproduce political practices that are far from clean, they do provide a certain link to a popular sentiment and to what to also create kind of say a conveyor belt of people of certain political energy, talent, whatever, who can actually make it further up in the. And this is how you make good politics. This is how you make a good democracy, is by letting people of talent and energy and imagination rise in the ranks. So I think the new model of fundraising, as it were, the political mode of fundraising, is actually detrimental. Yeah.
Two more. Sorry, I know there's many hands, but we're going to just do two more. Actually over there and like that. And then we continue the questions later.
Thank you, member. And yes, but I'd like to understand from the historical point of view, from what I heard, I thought you said it started with the East India Company. Can we take it as that, or would you look at it as something that is cultural ethos of Indians? And should the problem also be solved at that level, besides what all we have been discussing about policy? And
yeah. Now this is of course one. I mean, the colonial. I brought up the colonial state because in some ways it's a great story that the whole building of the colonial state begins with this great grand theft and all that. That shows that the whole idea, and sometimes a slightly nostalgic version of the past you get, is that, you know, in the past, in the 50s, things were much better, or during the colonial era, it surely wasn't that bad, but yes, it was really bad. Right? So that's one thing. I wouldn't say that's the cause of all corruption, but I think what the company state and the colonial state did was to give rise to a particular kind of formal state, formal institution, form of relating how institutions negotiate and contact and deal with the population, right? Which is, you all know, right? The collector being God and so on and so forth, and the whole rituals of distance. That's what I talk about. Which is not, it's not that every state apparatus in the world functions in that way. The Indian state apparatus has a very heavy colonial legacy in terms of that distance, and I think in a popular democracy where people's demands are proliferating all the time, that particular culture of distance and aloofness, which for some people is a guarantee of impartiality and non-corruptness and all that. There's no evidence of that, by the way. But, you know, for some people they think that this, and this is what the colonial state officials thought, and you will find people to this day, many people, who will argue that, you know, all the well-educated IAS officers and the cadres and higher up there are incorruptible. I don't know. I don't see how the big scams can happen if that was the case. It's simply very to the country. So that's why I think the formal state, the formal institution, the way the police works, for instance, the police services in this country, the police force, completely unreconstructed since the colonial age. Something I find absolutely scandalous. Which is why they don't have a good way of. It's not a police service; it's a police force. Where you beat people up, or you know, it's a colonial form of police, and it's not a police service. That's why most people don't feel comfortable going to the police. It's the last place you want to go. If you want to live under the rule of law, the police station has to be a place where you can go, and that has not been addressed in independent India. It defies any logic. Surely there can be no vote ban taken out among policemen to prevent that. So the other thing is a cultural thing. This is what the Brits always said. Right? that these Indians are fundamentally, corrupt, and this is so on. I don't think that's how it is, but I think that if you have a contrast or coexistence of a steeply hierarchical society where everything, your personal worth, your access to anything is graded and structured by your place in the hierarchy, and it's not fooled ourselves. Caste is not going away in India. There's no evidence, actually evidence to the contrary. It may have other functions, but the logic is still there, as strong as ever. So if you have that, and you have a state apparatus and a democratic policy that gives people services and programs on the basis of various forms of entitlements that are determined not on the basis of your social standing in caste or community-wise, but actually on other forms of other bases of entitlement. Not all of it. Reservations, of course, is not like that. Reservations are distinctly not like that. But if you have that, that's going to be a clash. It has to be a clash. There is a tension between these things. And that's the tension that these guys I was talking about negotiate. That's their job. That's the fundamental space they operate in, is that space. And which is why I think, say with some certainty, that if you have bases in India, that would probably be someone who has to go out and do a systematic study. But go to Kerala, other places where you have high levels of entitlement, high levels of education and all that, you will find some of this petty corruption is actually at a lower level. It doesn't exist in quite the same thing. So it cannot. This is a big thing. So if there is any cultural component in it, there's the persistence of a mindset, as I said, a kind of form of idea of moral obligation to the next person that is always structured in advance by an assessment of what this person is and whether this person is worthy of my sympathy. And the fact is that for many people, the only people who are worthy of your sympathy are people like yourself or at the same rank or completely or whatever. That's a fact.
Well, yes, now if you're going to take, there's lots of people with hands, but you all have been raising it. So can we just take these two questions and then you decide? And as to everyone else, we're doing a reception downstairs. We can ask him all our questions later, yeah? So you and then you.
Okay, my question, hi.
Yeah, oh, sorry. I can only hear the sound. I can't hear it, sorry.
So my question is more to understand from you from an anthropological perspective.
Yeah.
Power did say that if we have read Foucault and all, is by its very nature is very corrosive and corruptive. And we have seen that in totalitarian states this happens. However, history says, and we have read, the first few years of any democracy is always marked with corruption.
Yeah.
That's one thing. And second, since you have written a lot about India, you have visited places, you have met people. I personally have worked in very backward states of the country. How much do you think corruption at all is at the top of the mind of the people? In particular regions, or it's just a drawing room for, discussion for upper middle class and middle class like us, where it's more of an existential dilemma for many of us. So, I'd just like to understand this.
You want to take the next question as well and then answer the
That's fine. That's fine. I just want to keep these 2 points in. Yeah. That's fine.
Okay.
Noted.
So, is there any relation?
Yes.
Is there any relationship between dispensation of justice, the efficiency of dispensation of justice, and education? Like even in our country, is there like you said, there's Kerala or the Northeast where there is higher levels of literacy, or are their courts functioning better? As in, because that is also one thing that relates to corruption. As in, people go unpunished, so more and more people think that they can get away with it. So, is there anything to do with education at all, or is it economic? What is the relationship between justice and?
Well, I think to take the last point first, I think it's clear that people who have education and who are able to speak for themselves in certain ways and approach the judicial system in ways that are with a certain level of understanding, but first and foremost with a certain confidence, I think, are more likely to get justice. I'm not saying that you get justice, but they're more likely to get it in the end. I think that's a pretty universal trend that courts and judges and juries and whatever, all of the whole system is, of course, not set apart from the values that govern the rest of society, which means that if you are an educated college professor who walks into a law office and you report, or to a police station you report something, and you hire a lawyer and whatever, you do all the necessary, chances are you will actually go through the system, and the judge will also, your evidence will be taken seriously and so on and so forth. And this is, there's a good body of scholarship on law, not as much as there should be in India, that shows that there is a systematic discrimination, a systematic distinction in even the nature of evidence that's accepted from people with education and without education. There are Supreme Court judgments from the 60s and 70s that determine that in cases actually of conversion cases where people say, I want to convert to something, you know, if you're an educated person, it will be accepted, okay, he wants to be whatever. But if you are a lower class person, the judges have ruled, and there's a scholar called Mark Gallatin who's written about it, have ruled that that can only be accepted as a valid conversion if investigators are sent to the community to ascertain that these people speak the truth. So there is even a sense that, you know, fundamental habeas corpus, you have a right to, in a sense, you defend yourself or be a legal entity is differentiated according to whether you are educated or not. So I think the answer is yes, it makes a big difference. But I have to answer the other question first. Sorry. Questions. Is India just living through the birth pangs of democracy, like the Gilded Age in America of grand theft at all levels, and other parts of the world? Yes, it's possible. It's possible. It's possible. It's too early to tell, but I think there's one thing that's a little different, perhaps, and that is that democracy in India was a unique event in the sense that it's the first time ever in history that you give the universal franchise to a population that's predominantly, at that time, actually literate. So that is something that makes India, that was never true in any other country. And needless to say, that creates the need for all kinds of mechanisms, such as those I was talking about, which is 50 years later. Whether that is going to change, I mean, the other thing is, Ambedkar famously said that when he was drafting the Constitution, we stand at a threshold, a great paradox between obeying or celebrating the principle of one man, one vote in politics, but that's the only field in which we actually accord people that different. Right? That is still absolutely true. So time will change some of this, indeed. I don't think one can, I don't think there's ever, I don't know of any experiment with democracy any other place where, in a country where the institutions of equality are so many and so diverse and so deep. And democracy is about equality. Democracy is, like Tocqueville said, you know, it's about a certain kind of infectious spirit of equality. Right? He was, of course, very optimistic and all that in some ways. He was also, I think, very extremely clear-eyed about what happens in American democracy. But I think that spirit of equality takes many different forms, and one of the forms it takes is actually, for instance, demands for reservations. It's demands for all kinds of things, and it shouldn't be. I think it's one of the forces unleashed by democracy. Right? and it has to work its way through. It's ultimately a very powerful force. Larry, who's sitting here, is really knows much more about this than I do. In comparison sense, especially. I know a little bit about India. But so yes, it's possible. But I don't think it will not take the same route as other places necessarily. The second one was, I forgot about it.
So, do people really perceive corruption as the biggest problem?
No, I don't. That's right. I wouldn't say that it's just a middle class sort of pastime. So I think it's a real thing, and I here rely, for instance, on one of my colleagues from LSE, who has written great things. He's worked with Chhattisgarh. Jonathan Perry has written fantastic stuff on Chhattisgarh, and he shows very clearly that the whole worry about corruption is a deep-rooted one that you find in many communities. There is no reason to believe that a particular kind of moral outrage of being robbed, right, is the preserve of those who are being harmed. Although the outrage there is of a different nature. So I think it's there, but it may not be that which is the most pressing problem. If you're going to be hard at Chhattisgarh, whatever, Chhattisgarh people will probably say we want safety and security. We want access to jobs. We actually want the payment from the Narega scheme instead of that being siphoned off by postmasters in villages and so on. That's what we need. Right? What we heard today in this one presentation. These are the things people will say. But corruption as a big general blank for election that will win elections across India, I don't think so.
And on that note, I want to thank you, Professor.